Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us today for our first SE Color webinar. Today's topic is Beyond Tuskegee, COVID vaccination in community of colors. And we have a great program lined up. And so I'm really excited for this discussion. Now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator and also the chair, our first chair of SE Color, Cornelius Bankston.
Thank you, Jason. It's such a pleasure to be here and welcome everyone. Just to give a little background about SE Color is a division of Southeast Life Sciences. It's an organization dedicated to support minority life science entrepreneurship, to increase investment in minority-owned life science businesses, and improve minority access to information and clinical opportunities. And also, this webinar is sponsored by Moderna. So it's a great pleasure to now introduce our esteemed panel. We have Dr. Jane Morgan, who is clinical director and part of the COVID task force at Piedmont Healthcare, Pastor Jeremy Tuck, who is senior pastor at Living Faith Tabernacle, and Dr. Joshua Sklar, who is chief medical officer at BioIQ. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jane Morgan, who's going to kick us off with some historical information and set up the talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cornelius, and welcome everyone. We are so happy. This is our inaugural year of Southeast Color. We are a part of the bigger umbrella of Southeast Life Sciences. And so this is our very first webinar. And we really wanted to take the time to focus on the importance of clinical trials, the COVID vaccines, and the historical context and relationships of the African-American community with research and with healthcare. Both of those relationships have been historically tenuous. And although many of us may be familiar with Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, there are other stories that, inherently we know with research that have not had great outcomes for us and that have been dealt in a very nefarious way. And so I want to talk about Dr. James Marion Sims as we open this conference today, this webinar. Dr. James Marion Sims was known as the father of gynecology. He was known as the father of gynecology because he developed a procedure for correcting fistulas in women. Fistulas are small holes, connections that should not be there, that can develop, that connect either the vagina and the rectum or the vagina and the urethra. And they cause a great deal of discomfort, oftentimes infections, and impact quality of life. He developed a procedure to repair these fistulas. In doing so, he was lauded as the father of gynecology in restoring really basic health to a lot of women. But the story that wasn't told behind the scenes was that he developed this procedure by experimenting on Black women. And I'm using the word procedure, but really what we're talking about are surgeries. He performed countless practice surgeries as he perfected his technique, as he developed it, including resecting tissue, meaning cutting things out of people, sewing people up. To add to the heinousness of this, these women were not afforded any anesthesia whatsoever. They screamed and writhed and lost consciousness. Their reward was they were provided food. They had no advocacy for themselves. They had no voice. He performed over 100 procedures, think surgeries on women, on Black women with no anesthesia, surgeries that were not real surgeries. He's learning on these people. One woman in particular had over 40 surgeries. Her entire life is ruined. He actually developed a very great procedure. And when he unveiled it, it was unveiled to white women who underwent this procedure with full anesthesia, had great quality of life, and he was heralded as the father of gynecology. We finally had the bronze statue of him that's been erected in New York, removed in 2018. These are the kinds of stories that behind the scenes that inherently in our gut, even if we don't know the details, we know that they are there. We understand that the healthcare system and the research community often doesn't value our lives. Our lives don't matter equally to the lives of whites. And that's why it's important to have these conversations in the context of this COVID vaccine, because this COVID vaccine brings together the triumvirate of the issues that impact the African American community. Number one, it brings in healthcare, where we have a tenuous relationship with the healthcare system. It also heavily involves research, where we are probably another 2 standard deviations out closer to 0 if you want to bring in research for reasons that I've just reviewed. And then it also rolls in the US government, where we have another uneasy relationship with the US government that funded the Tuskegee experiment. Remember, that was the US government funded research program. All 3 of those come together to develop the COVID vaccine. And so should we be surprised that there's hesitancy to take this vaccine? We've got all 3 corners collapsing at once. Absolutely not. This is not a surprise. And then you add in additional scientific advancements that most people have never heard of. We're now going to provide you with messenger RNA. What is that? We haven't had these vaccines before, and now there's another entire scope to understand. So it's clear why many people, especially populations of color, certainly the African American population, has stepped back and you haven't stepped forward. And one of the things we want to be able to provide in this webinar, open conversation and discussion regarding information. We want people to have information, because that is what allows you to make good decisions. Information. Without information, our brains are very active. What takes over? Imagination. And there we go down the social media slope. So we want to replace that imagination and true historical context with some real information as to what does it mean to be involved in clinical trials in 2021? What does it mean to be in the midst of a COVID pandemic and have a vaccine under emergency use authorization? And what does that mean for our communities? I think you're on mute, Cornelius.
The joys of technology, as I was speaking and lauding all the words that you were speaking and giving us that historical context, that is amazing. So just to open it up a little bit more broadly, those are great points. So as a physician in the Metro Atlanta area that has a charge to help educate the population around the COVID vaccine, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing as it relates to disseminating this information, as you were speaking, to the population broadly? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Well, the biggest challenge is that we're inside of a pandemic and we can't see one another, right? The influence of interaction and the influence of touch and that personal conversation, that's taken away from us here. Now, obviously technology provides that, but I would say that is a big challenge when you want to talk with people and have very personal conversations with people about where not only we are as a culture, but where an individual person may be in their journey and their thought process. It's very difficult to do. It's a challenge with technology. Technology provides a vehicle. But in these situations where often these are very gut-wrenching, soul-searching, historical, familial conversations, sometimes, technology is a tool, but sometimes it's not the best tool, but it is what we have for now, but it may not be the best tool for addressing this with regard to all of the emotional context that goes with it.
Oh, I think this is a great kind of, throw it over to Pastor Jeremy Tuck around when you mentioned communication. Being a pastor of a Black church in Metro Atlanta, disseminating information to your congregants is very important. They see you as, the epicenter of information. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing from where you sit, Pastor Tuck, as it relates to disseminating this information about the COVID vaccine to your parishioners?
Well, thank you guys for having me on this afternoon. I'm absolutely honored. Um, when I think of us being the epicenter of the African American community, when you think of the African American community, the church was the place where most African American folks got their information. Through history, it's been a proven fact, and even today, we are still one of the largest voices in our community. And being a voice in the community, the challenge is now become for us, or has become for us. We've validated politicians, we've validated many different sources, and there were moments or seasons where those individuals did not follow through on what their promises were or what they would actually say or do. And now, here, as again, being the epicenter of the African American community and being a leader and a voice in the community, now the medical companies and the medical physicians are now coming to us, encouraging us to tell our congregants to get the vaccine. But the challenge becomes is that both companies, and this may be a misquote, but in my research, both companies have no liabilities, which means I can't come back to you. I can't come back to the federal government if I have any adverse effects. And so that's been another challenge that the church, or an alarming challenge that the church continues to face as we're pushing our voice, because as we're saying to them, you should go get the vaccine, but the distrust from the government, and then the distrust from the different pharmaceutical companies. And now we have a vaccine that is now seemingly came out overnight, and now no one wants to take responsibility that if something happens to the individuals that we've encouraged to take the vaccine, no one is being held liable or responsible for the adverse effects that the folks that you want me to encourage to take the vaccine, who's going to be the liable party if I've encouraged them to take this vaccine and then and they die or something happens, which we know that happens within vaccines. But the question lies is that even myself have some apprehensions of, as a leader and as a voice for the African American community, of who's liable for this. You've created the vaccine, but where are the liabilities, and who's going to take the responsibility for the long-term effects of what is going to happen with this vaccine? So the challenge for us is encouraging our folks that they can trust the medical companies, that they can trust the federal government. Dr. Morgan stated the 3 pillars. It's like deja vu all over again. And we're saying, who do we trust? And so now trying to encourage the African American community and getting the voices, or the African American voices, to say, hey, this is what we have to do and what we must do. But there is a level of distrust because of who's going to be the responsible party that we can go back to if this fails or if this doesn't work.
Okay, great points. I think that's a great point you're making around trust. So I want to push it over to Dr. Joshua to help us understand from industry perspective, how, and from the work that you all have done with COVID testing within different populations, immigrant populations, et cetera, how have you been able to develop that trust from an industry lens? As Pastor Tuck was, I'm going to make him Dr. Tuck, as Pastor Tuck was saying, around the mistrust and the distrust within the Black community, what have you all done proactively as it relates to COVID testing, not necessarily the vaccine, from where you sit?
So let me start by saying BioIQ, the company I work for, it represents a lot of new companies in healthcare, I think, today, which are really trying to change the way that healthcare is delivered and the way that healthcare is perceived. And I think that's a trend we're going to continue to see, and I think it's an important trend. But I think culturally, that industry, companies like ours, we tend to focus in large part on changing the convenience, making the healthcare easier to access, making it cheaper. We're a little bit of a product of just industry at large. I mean, we've all been kind of influenced by companies like Amazon and Netflix that have made our lives incredibly convenient. And so we try and do that in healthcare rather than focusing on some of the other determinants that really are key to success if you're going to move the needle on the health of a population or a community. And one of which is obviously trust, overcoming medical mistrust is a big one. So I don't think we're great at it. I mean, I'm going to say mea culpa right out of the gate. That's not inherent in our DNA. That's not how we think about a problem. We're much more likely to think about how do we make this more convenient for people than we are to think about how do we get people to trust this, right? My experience in the COVID pandemic is largely in the testing space, so I appreciate your calling that out, and I'll just talk about the testing experience a little bit. It's definitely different from the vaccine world. People's apprehensions about testing are different. Their questions about testing are different from the ones they have about vaccines. But one thing that we learned early on in the pandemic was how to address basic questions like, why should I take this test? Especially because at that time, it wasn't really super clear to everyone that the test result would benefit them. It was more something that would benefit maybe the health department or the hospital system that was trying to manage an outbreak, right? One of the things that I think helped us early on in the pandemic was our emphasis on going to the community to deliver testing. So, for example, I think folks probably remember around a year ago, a little less than a year ago this time, there were some terrible, terrible COVID-19 outbreaks in the meatpacking industry, in the food industry. And that industry was in the news as a essential industry and vital to national security and part of the food supply. And yet the people working in that industry faced really challenging working conditions. They were oftentimes very vulnerable and marginalized populations, not native English speaking populations, people of color, and they're also happen to be located in rural areas where there's not like an intensity of healthcare resources. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that was really successful for us was partnering with provider groups to physically go to these small rural towns where there'd be a large factory and provide the testing there on site, rather than asking people to go to a healthcare facility or go to a clinic, to go to a hospital, to go to a lab, which was a heavy lift, to be honest, for a business picking up and moving a testing business and a bunch of providers to Waterloo, Iowa, and testing, 10,000 people who speak maybe 20 different languages, and trying to build trust at the same time was a challenge. That's even more so pivoting to the vaccine conversation because, frankly, it's a lot easier to pick up a bunch of tests and go to the community with them than it is to take vaccines into the community. I do have some experience bringing, for example, flu vaccines out into people's homes. Was pretty active with the business doing that in the Southeast. That was hard. And this vaccine is significantly harder to handle than a flu shot. So that's a little bit my come from, which is to say, I don't think industry really understands how to build trust in these communities, if I'm being honest. And I think making matters even more complicated, there are some really tough logistical problems to getting out into the community from behind, sort of our walls and the cubicles of our business. That's sort of my come from, and I'm, definitely interested to hear conversation around how to overcome those challenges.
Sure. Dr. Morgan
and the pastor have made really some good points. And if I could just take a moment to address some of that when we talk about trust, when we talk about liability, when we talk about we don't understand. Part of that is because we don't participate in clinical trials. The reason we don't participate in clinical trials is related to sort of my opening statement, that we've been abused and we haven't been treated fairly. And there's really been no mercy shown to us or any forgiveness. And so when we look at clinical trials, though, in the United States, every major drug and device that is on the market today has come through clinical trials. So if we don't participate in these clinical trials, then exactly what the pastor is saying, exactly what Joshua is saying is the end result. We don't have confidence that this data and that these drugs and vaccines have any relevance to our population whatsoever, because the data is done on the white males who enroll in these trials. And we certainly have numerous examples as a cardiologist, which is what I am, when we see patients and we are prescribing these medications for the first time to these populations, and they come back and report side effects while they're at Disney World, or they're on a cruise, or they're at a Little League game. When you're out in the real world, wouldn't it have been better if you were going to have side effects, to have had those side effects within a controlled research environment? If you're enrolled in a clinical trial, you have direct access to a clinical research coordinator or nurse that you can contact 24 hours a day. Your physician or another physician is serving as the principal investigator to oversee you. There is a regional physician overseeing that local physician. There's a national physician overseeing the regional physician who's overseeing the local physician. You've got a team of people who are invested in getting this right and moving that data forward. Additionally, if you are uninsured or underinsured, this is how you get access to healthcare. Oftentimes the companies cover patients who are enrolled in these trials, but we don't access that. And so it's the white males who have the benefit of it. And so the data that is developed is data that is relevant to them with the longest lifespan in the United States. And so we've got to begin to rethink what clinical trials really mean. A great example is when we look at Donald Trump. When he contracted COVID-19, he was sitting in the White House, 74 years old, overweight, and desaturating, meaning his oxygen levels were dropping. Everybody in the medical community understood his downward trajectory. They put him on a helicopter and took him to Walter Reed. And what happened when he arrived there? He immediately received Regeneron's monoclonal antibody therapy. Most people had never heard of it. You know why? Because it's not available. It hasn't been FDA approved. Donald Trump received it under emergency use authorization as the president of the United States. And the only other people who received it were those people who were enrolled in clinical trials. That monoclonal antibody therapy was credited with interrupting his downward course of this COVID, even as his physicians came out and gave their vague statements. In the medical world, we understood what that means. That is platinum level healthcare. That's the healthcare that's behind the curtain that we step away from. The healthcare of tomorrow. You get tomorrow's therapy. You get the therapies of the future.
Sure.
We don't get access to that. And I would just say, if you're seeing your physician and you're not being offered a clinical trial and you've got some type of chronic medical condition that you are managing, you are being treated optimally, meaning your physician is treating you to the absolute top of evidence-based medicine, FDA-approved drugs and therapies, but you are not being treated maximally if you're not being offered access. That's what we're talking about. To clinical trials. And I will just close by saying, we talk about being guinea pigs, but on which end are we really guinea pigs? Are we guinea pigs on the front end? And so we were the front end of research, and so we refuse to participate? Or are we guinea pigs on the back end when all the drug development is completed and is approved and is on the market, and that's the first time you're going to see it? On which side are we really the guinea pigs? And that's what we need to understand. The reason we don't trust it is that we're not involved in clinical trials. And so we can't be confident that the data has any relevance to us.
It's like a double-edged sword. So I think the thing that I really want to hear from is the pastor, because one of the things that I'm seeing now, as you made that very well stated out, is how do you develop, so how do you localize this information that you just shared to the population that Pastor Tuck speaks to Sundays and Wednesdays and Tuesdays that he have access to? Because I think there's a huge disconnect about the communication channel right? How do you speak in a way that is localized to those individuals so they can understand and be empowered by it, opposed to being afraid of it?
Mhm.
Pastor Tuck, any ideas of the best ways to communicate to the population that you have reached to?
Well, for us, the more information that we have, which of course Dr. Morgan has given some valid points and valid information that I can take back to my congregation. The more information we have, the more confident we are when we're standing in front of them saying, you know, this is this, I have this information. I think the challenging thing since COVID has been the limited information that we have, and we've been kind of going off of. And I did want to ask this question. A lot of our folks were asking, why 2 vaccines? What do you mean by, you know, this affects the RNA and not the DNA? And, you know, if you ask me something in hermeneutics, I could explain, you know, something hermeneutical, but when you ask a pastor who this is not my field, this is not what I'm versed in, when they come back and say to us, what does this mean? Why am I taking 2 vaccines instead of 1? What does this mean, DNA, RNA? I think it's hard to communicate information that you don't have, you know, information to. I think we have a tailored piece, but it's nice to have the theological perspective of what Dr. Morgan sees and what Joshua sees. And then we can take that information, because even today I'm gleaning information from what you're saying to me, and breaking that down so I can communicate it better to the folks in my community.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Dr. Morgan, we know that science is evolving. There's nothing static as it relates to science, as it relates to understanding this disease, as we kind of try to understand the impact, the long-term impact of this disease. How can you, because we have different people on this webinar, how can you help them to understand the evolution of science, the evolution of medicine? Because some people's like, well, they say now we got J&J saying there's a single dose vaccine coming out. Now we have a 2-dose now. And so what's the difference? Because as we get more information in science, we know that we are better armed to develop more and more robust therapeutics. How can you help give some people some clarity, some reassurance around that?
So when you look at the data, and I'm going to talk about the data that Moderna and Pfizer actually submitted to the FDA, those briefing documents that I have read multiple times. That's how I spend my weekends. If you want to know how I spend my weekends, I read FDA briefing documents.
Awesome.
When we look at the subpopulation, which I was specifically interested in, of African Americans, of Blacks who are enrolled in that trial, in general, for all of the reasons that I've gone over, we really don't participate in research. We're not involved in clinical trials. And so what we see is, you know, sometimes just 4% of Blacks enrolled in trials. And that's generally with intention. We tried to have some people enroll, and we approached people. Moderna actually did very well. Even though we're 13.4% of the population here in the United States, they enrolled 10.3% of African Americans into their trial, and Pfizer enrolled 9.3%. They were very intentional and purposeful and inclusive. Even though it wasn't perfect, certainly fell short of 13.4%, it was pretty good. And when you look at the collective volume of people, Moderna enrolled 30,000 people into their phase 3, that final trial. And Pfizer enrolled 40,000 people. So we're talking about 70,000 people, and an average of 10% of those were Blacks. That's about 7,000 people were enrolled in those trials. And so I think we can feel confident that we were actually represented in those trials. What I also saw when I looked in those briefing documents was that the only subpopulation, when I looked at the different groups of data, that suffered no incidences of COVID-19 2 weeks following that second dose, and I mean 0, were the African Americans enrolled in that trial.
Oh, wow.
So even though Moderna and Pfizer's efficacy was 94.5% and 95%. The African American subpopulation had 100% efficacy.
Okay.
That was very interesting. And that is why it's important for us to participate in trials so we can have confidence that the data is relevant to our population.
Very powerful. Powerful. Another just tag on what what Pastor Tucker was asking around, why 2 vaccines? Why is there a Pfizer vaccine? Why is there a Moderna vaccine? Why is there a J&J vaccine?
Right. So Moderna and Pfizer, and they didn't consult with me first. So I'll tell you what they did. They developed 2 vaccines. They decided they wanted to look at the model of booster. You know how we get measles shots and then you get the booster a few years later. They decided that they wanted to shorten that interval of that booster and do that model. So that first shot, what we see again in the FDA briefing documents, gets you to about a 50 to 60% level of protection. And in fact, it still requires 8 to 12 days after that first shot for your immunity levels to even start to increase. And that's why people can still contract COVID after receiving the shot, because you still don't have protection the first 8 to 12 days. Your body is starting to build it. And even going up to your second shot, you pretty much are at 50 or 60%. It's that second shot, the one that we hear, oh, I'm going to experience side effects. I'm going to, have a headache. I'm going to have fever. I'm going to have chills. That second shot takes you to that really remarkable level of 95% efficacy. So it's like starting a car. You're going to feel that. And so oftentimes people feel that, but that's that level of protection that we're talking about. The Israeli studies that just came out this week, which were observational studies, not randomized clinical trials. And so I won't go into the difference on that, but I would just say an observational study is not quite as scientifically astute as a randomized clinical trial. Nevertheless, in these observational studies, they saw in the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine that one shot might get you to 85 or 90% efficacy in their population. They're Israelis. The United States has a mosaic population. So, but that's interesting when we start to have this discussion of, is one shot going to be enough or 2 shots going to be enough? So what I will say is we're moving forward currently with 2 shots. The reason for that is all the data that we have in the clinical trials was done on 2 shots. So we need to follow the information that we have. We didn't do clinical trials with just a single shot. We did them with 2 shots. The data we have is on both of those shots. And so we need to move forward with that because that's the information that we have.
Okay. I see Jason popped in, but I got one more question to ask you, Dr. Morgan, just to, in layman's terms, so the population can understand what's the difference between messenger RNA, mRNA, and DNA, and how that isn't changing your genetic makeup.
Yeah, and you should not, be embarrassed that you don't know the difference between that. Most scientists and doctors don't remember. You learn that your first year of medical school, and then you pretty much don't use it again. So, messenger RNA and DNA sound very similar. RNA is just a code. It's a messenger. It delivers like information, and then it disappears. And so you can think of it a little bit as like your DNA, your nucleus. Your DNA is maybe like a cookbook. And the messenger RNA comes in and just makes a copy of the recipe in the cookbook. The cookbook doesn't change, right? It's still the same. Nothing happened to the cookbook. Messenger RNA just made a copy, and then it went out with that copy and was able to develop some protein. You can think of it that way. And then it denatures, it disappears from our bodies. That's one of the reasons why it's been a long time in developing messenger RNA vaccines, because it doesn't stick around. We couldn't figure out how to let it stick around long enough to actually do its work. So after that, it does denature and disappear from the body.
Awesome.
So and I had a question, Dr. Morgan, for you. So if messenger aren't, if it disappears from the body, are you saying that each year it would be similar to the flu shot? The continuation of just getting vaccinated each year to ensure that you don't contract COVID-19, or how's that? How should we tailor that
Right.
to the folks that we're talking to.
So you're asking about immunity data. So the messenger RNA appears, but it leaves the code that develops that spike protein. It's done its job. So it's done. And now your body recognizes that spike protein and is ready to mount a defense if it sees it again. If you come in contact with somebody with COVID, your body has been primed now to leave. Messenger RNA is done. It's done its job, right? It brought the message and now it's gone. That was just the messenger. Don't kill the messenger. Right. So so it's gone.
Okay.
What you're talking about is immunity and whether or not we're going to need this shot every year or every 10 years. And that's the answer that we don't know, because that's the caveat of not having FDA approval. This is not FDA approved. It's under EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. That is a recognition that all of the data was not complete, but that our population was at risk. And that the safety, what do we have available? The safety data was available, all of the efficacy data, efficacy meaning how well it works in protecting you from COVID. All of that data was available and reviewed and thought to be very sound. And so they released it under emergency use authorization. Generally, what happens is for FDA approval, you follow all 70,000 of these people for a year or two, right? And you measure their titers and you measure their antibodies. And so by the time you get to FDA, you know how long immunity is conferred because you've been following these people. But we didn't do this time. We followed only out to 2 months. And then the FDA granted emergency use authorization. So at this point, we know, I think we might be out at 5 or 6 months, but every month, we have another month of data on whether or not we still have immunity. And then the next month, we have another month of data on those 70,000. So we actually, under an emergency use authorization in the middle of a pandemic, because of the risk to our population, we're all in this in real time. So the safety and efficacy data are solid. We know what those are, but we don't know the long-term data, because if we waited for that, the vaccines would not be able to become available for another year or two. And we thought the population was too much at risk. So we are waiting to find out what that immunity data is. Every single month, we have another month. We're following those patients. So stay tuned.
Wow. Wow. I'm just wow, because I feel like this is what people need to hear, Dr. Morgan, as it relates to the evolution of the vaccine, right? As we gather more information, we become more knowledgeable about the vaccine. Joshua, any questions, any feedback that you have? I don't want to monopolize the conversation because I got a list in my head. I can just rattle them off. Joshua?
Well, I did want to ask one question related to this topic, which is, my bias as a physician, as a scientist, is what either wins or loses my trust is probably the data more than anything. So I may or may not trust Moderna or Pfizer, but I do trust scientific publications and I'll read them. But number one, I recognize that's not for everyone. I mean, my wife, for example, is a very educated, intelligent woman. She reads a ton, but she's not going to read a New England Journal article on a vaccine study. And two, if you are a person who's not well represented by that data, then you're certainly going to be less interested in reading it. Seems like even less reason to go read an arduous scientific study. So one of my questions is, what are the alternative sources of information in the absence of that data, in the absence of reading these studies that communities are comfortable with, that they're listening to? One of the things that we run up against in our business, for example, is we run up against the effects of a lot of predatory marketing, a lot of, frankly, marketing scams that have kind of poisoned the well a little bit and have eroded trust. And I think to a certain extent, we run into a lot of news media and social media that fills the void of, say, data from a scientific study. But I'm curious where the people that you minister to or you serve in your hospital or in your community, where that information comes from, if they're not represented in the scientific data, in the first place?
So I think that's a great question, and you do need to find a trusted source of information. And so I'm going to just volunteer myself because I do read the New England journals. I do read the FDA briefing documents. So you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter or LinkedIn at Dr. Jane Morgan, Jayne Morgan. I post a series called Stairwell Chronicles, where I sit on the stairs and I answer a question about the COVID vaccines in 1 minute. I take 1 minute, I take a question, and I use that vignette and I answer that question. And each day I will go through a different question. And so those are the kinds of things that might be helpful, but not just me. I'm just an example. Find a trusted source of information. It could be the CDC website. Keep up with what's happening at the CDC. Maybe open the website once a week and read. You do have to read. If you were to follow me or someone else on social media, obviously it's less reading. We're telling you the information, but find some person or organization or website that is a science-based website or organization or individual, and follow that person or those, that entity, and make certain that you get good information, right? Because I'm not here, and none of us are here to convince you to take the vaccine. I want you to start to think about when you might start thinking about taking the vaccine. And the reason I say that is I know that there's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of gut wrenching. And I also say that because we don't even have enough vaccine for everybody. So you can think about it. You don't have to do it today. You've got time to digest. You've got time to research it. You've got time to figure out, who's going to be your scientific source. You have time to get your questions vetted, while, of course, wearing your mask, washing your hands, and maintaining a social distance. So just think about that. We want you to have information so you can begin to think.
Right. Awesome. There's a question in the chat from Miss Alexander. What can you as physicians do to help the church? It's a two-part question. So that's the first question. And then the second one is, what would you, I guess this is more towards you, Pastor Tuck, what would you as a religious person ask of the medical community? So first question, what can you as a physician do to help the church?
Is that for me or is that for Pastor Tuck?
Yeah.
Okay, for me. So to help the church. So one of the things I think is we're back to that communication and having a trusted source of information and having somebody answer questions, common questions. What about allergies? Well, these vaccines are not live vaccines, so allergies are not relevant. What about long haul syndrome? That's something we need to think about. What we know when we talk about long haul syndrome, these are ongoing symptoms that patients have who've had COVID-19 months later, up to 9 months. They're still suffering, especially neurologic symptoms, a loss of taste and smell, chronic headaches, brain fog, disorientation, difficulty with memory, in addition to lung and heart inflammation. Oftentimes, these also are people who were not hospitalized, who had fairly mild courses. In fact, who just sat home and quarantined and maybe played video games and felt really well and kind of watched their clock to day 14 and they were out. And then they begin to develop symptoms later. These are called long haul syndromes. And what we have found is that 30% of people who've been diagnosed with COVID-19 develop long haul syndrome, and it cuts across all races, all genders, all socioeconomic, and it's independent of the severity or lack thereof of your COVID-19 course. And so when we think about these vaccines, not only think about how it prevents and protects you from COVID-19, if you are thinking that I'll take my risk with COVID-19 because most people don't get sick, think about this. It also provides some protection from that 30% whom we cannot identify. We do not know who that 30% will be. The vaccines also provide protection from developing long haul syndrome because it protects you from getting COVID-19 so you don't develop that long haul syndrome as well.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. Second part of the question, what would you as a religious person ask of the medical community, Pastor Tuck?
For me, basically information. The more information we have, the better. What we found even in the church is that people don't read. They kind of take what the pastor says oftentimes as law, and to ensure that we're giving concise information. Information for us is always key, and to ensure that what we're giving the congregants and the folks in our community is that it's concise information. And so we always use the scripture, our folks perish for the lack of knowledge. And so, but we also encourage those folks to go and glean your own knowledge. So the more knowledge that we have as clergy, I think it helps us to be better advocates for the scientific community, because we work hand in hand oftentimes, when we talk about faith and all of that. But I think the knowledge and the information helps us to bridge a bond. And so for me, as it relates to the medical field or the other folks on the medical side, the more information we have, the better we are. So we can stand, at the front of the lines together. And so information for me is what it has to be.
One last question I got. One, Jason,
Let me,
that we need to talk about is variance.
I want to jump in. Can I jump in and ask a follow-up question real quick? Sorry. How do you want that information, Pastor? Like, is it written? Do we come and share that with your congregation? Because we're trying to we'd like to recreate what we're doing here throughout the region with our state partners and others. So what's the best way to get that information to you?
So I think twofold. I think sometimes bringing clergy that does have a love for learning more and having more knowledge, inviting them to the rooms and having a conversation, a collective, is more of a collective, and having a conversation with them about how do we, because Dr. Morgan may come, and because she's a doctor, there may be things that she may say that may go over their heads. And so, but Dr. Morgan and I may be able to sit down collectively. Be able to sit down collectively.
Plain language.
And you were very plain. You were very plain. Really great, actually. But really tailoring it to their. Yes, theoretically speaking.
Right.
Yes. But no, Jason, to answer your question, like I said, it's twofold. I think, yes, coming in, having forums, because we do health fairs, but it's very simple. But I think really sitting the folks down and really having a conversation and allowing them to talk and ask in their own way, what is this? And really putting it in layman's terms. So I think it's twofold. I think inviting clergy to the table and having that conversation. And then I also think coming out of silos, because we all have silos. I think the religious institution has a silo, and I think we're kind of, bombarded by our silos. And I think the medical side has silos as well, but it's kind of coming out of our silos and merging together and figuring out how we can bridge the communication gap amongst us.
That's fantastic. I think we have some ideas there, Cornelius and Jane. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think that is great. My last question is around variants. Dr. Morgan, what are variants? Why do they just show up? What does that mean to me if I've had a vaccine and they're talking about a South African variant, a Brazilian variant? I know it's a loaded question, but if we could just help the population understand what's the variants, what do I do with this information since it's now circulating around the globe?
So when we talk about variants, we talk about mutations, right? So the virus is changing, and in science, the word mutation really just means change. And for us, I think when in the layman's term you use mutation, you think something's getting bigger and badder and angrier and meaner, and it's turning into something, but really it just means change. And sometimes viruses, bacteria, other organisms can actually mutate themselves out of existence. You can change and actually become weaker. And we've seen some of those that happen in some of these mutations with this SARS-CoV-2 as well. What we have to remember is all organisms, all life forms on Earth, strive for life. We want to live. And in order for it to live, this is how it lives. It can continue to change and learn and mutate. And so the mutations did not just arrive. In fact, since this SARS-CoV-2 pandemic began, we've had probably over 3,000 mutations. The tragedy of this is that even though we've identified a specific mutation in the United Kingdom, one in Brazil, one in South Africa, and we're pointing at those and saying, oh my goodness, does Moderna work against this one? Does Pfizer work against this one? Which does Johnson & Johnson have better efficacy? The fact of the matter is, while the United States is pointing its finger and doing all of these media reports on the other variants, does anybody have any idea of the percentage of variants here in the US of this SARS-CoV-2 virus that we've actually done any genomic tracing, genomic tracking, or analysis on here in this country where we are having this pandemic? Since this is not interactive, I'll give you the answer. 0.3%. So I'm going to give you a moment to let that sink in. So while we are looking at other countries and saying, there's this variant there in the UK, there's this variant in South Africa, we have to be concerned. At least they know what they have in their environment. We don't even know what's here. We're concerning ourselves with things in other countries, and we don't know what we have here in this country. We have not done the genomic, less than 1%, less than 0.5% of variants. Remember, I started this vaccine, this virus has changed more than 3,000 times. So when we look at these things, one of the things that they asked, we're concerned about, is whether these mutations are, more dangerous. What we've seen so far is that they are more infectious, meaning that if you come in contact with them, you are more likely to contract COVID by coming in contact. Their infectious rate is higher. So therefore, if they can infect people much more quickly and much more rapidly, they are more successful. They become more successful than the other variants. That's why you start to see them be dominant in an area, because they can move all the other variants out of the way because they are so successful in infecting people. And so when we talk about the increased numbers of hospitalizations, the increased numbers of death, what we've seen is that the percentage of hospitalizations and deaths haven't increased, just the volume, but the volume has increased because the volume of people infected has increased. So the percentages are the same. Nevertheless, when Moderna and Pfizer were doing their clinical trials, these variants were not around. So their clinical trials did not include these variants, not because they were sloppy, but because the mutations hadn't occurred yet when they closed their trial. The mutation was around when Johnson & Johnson was doing its trial. And it's one of the reasons that we think that the efficacy, how well it works, of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is less, at 72% in the US, 85% overall, but 72% in the US, and as compared to Moderna and Pfizer, which is 95%, because those variants were included in their trials. And the last thing I'll say about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single shot, and that even though it's 72% in the US, it was 85% effective at 30 days from preventing moderate and severe disease with absolutely no deaths. So this is certainly a player. We are welcoming it into our armamentarium. Mutations are going to continue to develop. The longer our population lacks immunity, the more the mutations can continue to develop. We have to continue to pursue population health measures, wearing a mask, washing your hands, practicing social distancing, not giving the virus a chance to continue to mutate and thrive as it gets into your body. Human beings are the host in the life cycle. We've got to remove ourselves from the life cycle of this virus.
Wow. I feel like we just need to do a whole clip notes kind of session over variants, mRNA, DNA.
Yeah.
You know, Jade, you take the lead, and we'll just have, you know, like little pods around so that we can get people educated around this. This has been great. Dr. Jane, thank you. Morgan, thank you for all the information you have shared. Dr. Joshua, thank you for the insights that you've provided. Pastor Tuck, the insights from what your parishioners might be facing, and even as you as a community leader, thank you for your honesty and transparency. We really appreciate it. I know we probably have some closing remarks because we're at how many minutes? We have about 3 minutes remaining, and there seems like there's a question, but I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Cornelius. Just remember, you guys are interested in information. You can follow me. I do give information every day. I provide that information for you. 1-minute vignettes. It's not an hour-long webinar. If you have 60 seconds in your day, listen to the question of the day. Learn something in 1 minute every day, and begin to sort of, put all the leaves on the branches and make a decision for yourself, right? We have time. We don't even have enough vaccine available.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll count that as your closing statement. Joshua, Pastor Tuck, y'all have anything minute or less to say here at the end?
Well, again, for me, thanks for the opportunity. I've learned a lot today. I'll be checking you out, Dr. J, and I'll definitely be checking you out, and you too, Joshua, just to get more familiar with BioQ. And again, the more information that I have, the better I can educate the folks that we serve and the people that are around us. And so I feel extremely educated today, and I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know. So I'm absolutely grateful. So thanks for the opportunity, and follow me on social media as well.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Yeah,
will do.
Yeah. So I'm Pastor Jeremy Tuck, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all that good stuff. So you can follow me there.
Dr. Sklar.
I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I'm so glad we're talking about this incredibly important, life-saving topic, and I've learned a ton. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. I want to thank Moderna for their sponsorship of this event. Just tremendous support. We will continue to look for support from other organizations as well, so we can do these. I think we had some great ideas about, bringing clergy together to us, and that could be something that, we'll have expenses for, as well as, I think this discussion, taking this on the road, I think would just be phenomenal. With our state groups and both bringing clergy together, as well as just going to their churches or events. So, if you have an organization that might want to sponsor, please let me know, reach out to me. Also, I will note that it's long, but southeastlifesciences.org, there is an SE Color page. On that page, I have a link to all of Dr. Jane Morgan's Stairwell Chronicles. So you'll be able to go directly to her LinkedIn from southeastlifesciences.org/SE Color. So with that, I really want to thank everybody. Thank you all. Thank attendees. If folks that are online, if you missed the beginning, I would encourage you to, I will get this up on YouTube here in the next day or two, see Jane's opening statement, because that was one of the most powerful things I've heard in a long, long time. So with that, thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.